The American Teilhard Association podcast features conversations and interviews which explore the life, thought, and vision of mystic scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. We express our gratitude to Dalesford Abbey in Paoli, Pennsylvania, for allowing us to use their space and equipment in making this episode possible. The following conversation is the first in a three-part series where host Andrew Del Rossi and psychologist Thomas Legere discuss the implications of the convergences and divergences, as well as the emergence of insight and wisdom from the thoughts of Teilhard de Chardin and Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung. Welcome, everyone, to a very special edition of the American Teilhard Association podcast. I am Andrew Del Rossi, your host, and I am glad to welcome today Dr. Thomas Legere. Tom, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Andrew. Pleased to be here, and I know we're all connecting as soulmates across space and time. So may God lead everything that happens here this day.
Amen. And yeah, this is the second time we're having Tom back with us on the podcast. Tom and I had been going back and forth about, the possibility of doing some sort of dialogue between Teilhard and Jung, a speculative dialogue, because there's so much in common there. There's divergence as well, but there's so much to talk about, such richness. And we thought that the best way to do it justice would be to have a conversation about, maybe not really what their conversation would look like, but in us talking through their vision, their thought, and their persons, we might get a sense of what that might look like, that interplay. Tom, why is this conversation important, would you say, when we're talking about Teilhard, Jung, the integration of spirituality and psychology? Why is this important we have this conversation?
Well, because I read the newspapers every day. And I see that our world is in a crisis right now. Hopefully it's a creative crisis from which something good will come. But right now, we're kind of like strangers in a strange land. And thank God, because I'm sure that God is the one who sent these two people to us, Jung and Teilhard. Here are two pilgrims themselves who can give us some ideas of where we need to go. And both of these people have so much to offer. And amazingly, they haven't been appreciated much. In fact, in some ways, from my studies, I think that both Teilhard and Jung are the ones who offer the most to Christianity. And all it takes is just a shift in awareness, a little change in consciousness to understand what they're saying. So I'm here because I think this is important. I remember studying Jung up at Fordham back in the early 80s. And I was sitting in the front row taking these copious notes. And one of my students came up to me afterwards, a fellow student, and said, "Boy, you take the best notes." And I said, "Well, for you, it's probably just a class. For me, it's survival."
Yeah.
And she looked at me like, "Oh boy, we got a live one here."
Right.
And what I'm saying here is that these are not just ideas. This is a vision that has helped me understand Christianity on the deepest level possible. I've studied both of these people in some depth now, Jung and Teilhard. So I just welcome this opportunity for us to exchange ideas with the hope that this will help us all figure out where we are and where we need to go in this crazy world.
Yeah. And your background especially is invaluable as a psychologist, and a very credentialed one at that, in a number of areas. So as we dive into the psyche, so to speak, of Teilhard and Jung, you'll be providing us with critical insight as we journey through that process. As you said, you have a lifetime of experience of working with these two thinkers, working with them academically, pastorally, professionally as a psychologist. You've integrated their thought into your practice. So, I mean, I agree with you in terms of the juncture, if you want to call it that, or it's definitely some sort of crisis we're at right now. I kind of think it's a sort of bottleneck we're passing through, like a bottleneck of consciousness.
Yes.
And it's an interesting time. It's a rather unnerving time, but it feels like the thought of these men was made for this time almost, because it allows us to, like you said, have that slight shift, that slight augmentation that we need to usually experience what is a more expansive view of things. I mean, sometimes, it's not just, the expansiveness that draws us in. Sometimes it's something little, but, it doesn't take much, is what you're saying, to experience that shift.
It doesn't take much, but the times are critical.
Right.
We look, for example, at our churches. Mm-hmm. What you have there are the white hairs and the blue hairs, and what Shakespeare called the bare ruined choirs. And again, if a tweak or two could be made,
Right.
It seems to me that our religion, in the deepest sense of the Christ and the Christ view, could transform the world.
Yeah.
But as long as we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to see our churches and our schools and our rectories and our convents turned into condominiums, which is what's happening now.
Yeah, and you get a sense when you do weave these sorts of larger thinkers' thoughts into your work. I'm sure you've found that you do get a response. There is a resonance with people that is, I think, akin to what was present within the early church, especially, where they felt this closeness to the Spirit that filled everyone's life, right? And I think that is really what the thought and vision of Teilhard is able to do for people. It's able to rekindle that fire in a very Teilhardian sense, right? We all know that quote of rekindling fire, discovering love. Or it's rekindling love and discovering fire for a second time, is what he says.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, in my experience, I've been working with Teilhard as an academic for over 10 years now. And during that time, I've also been, employed pastorally, professionally as well. So working everywhere from with high school students to college students, with adults. There is a resonance for sure. And you may not always be able to explicitly, call it Teilhardian or Jungian in that way. But when you speak to these concepts, there are heads nodding. There are people going, right? There's a visceral reaction that starts to take place. Much like how Jung said that the meeting of two personalities, right, is like a chemical reaction. Sure. And when we provide this sort of thought or, this sort of vision to people and what they hunger for now, we start to see those bubbles that start to form as a result of this. So it's not to, single out Teilhard and Jung in this case. I mean, that's who we are focusing on. But, I mean, you could take any, saint or sage of relevance that has a resonance with people, and you get that reaction. So there's hope for me in that case that, people are seeking, people are turning towards pathways that are established and leading them towards that sense of being that is complete and whole in that way.
Yeah. We're not trying to sell a bill of goods here. We're not trying to jam anything down anybody's throat. We're just trying to show what these two people are saying.
That's
and
right.
We're just asking everybody, does this have the ring of authenticity? And when that happens, that's the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
That's not the ego. When the heart opens and not just the head, we're in the midst of something transformational. So, I can see that we are both excited about being here because we think that hopefully we have the gift of making things simple. And if we can find a way to translate some of that so that people can grab onto it even more, we'll make just a little bit more of a difference in our world.
That's it. So that's the direction in which we're headed with these conversations.
Yes, sir.
We'll be planning to break them up over the course of 3 different conversations. So let's get to it. Teilhard so really, he writes about our spiritual evolution, and Jung is more focused on our psychological evolution, especially the development in a way of the psyche in a way that makes sense spiritually too. There's a great gift there. Now, these two men never corresponded. There's never been any record of their correspondence, though there is record that they knew of each other's work, and presumably of some of the other's person. But so yeah, we're going to get into it today, and we'll start really at the beginning of things, where both men come from unique backgrounds. They were each formed in very specific ways. They were influenced by their families, by their surroundings. And I'm curious if Tom would be willing to start us off by illuminating some of Jung's childhood, his influences of his parents, of his grandparents, and how that maybe created the formation of the man that we know today.
Good. And I imagine everybody knows why we're doing this. I'm a developmental psychologist, and I'm convinced, I guess you are too, that the older you get, you realize how important the early lessons were, positively and negatively, the things that formed us as they did. So Jung was, by his own admission, born as an introvert. He had a father and mother with whom he had kind of a strained relationship. There was only one sibling. She was born when Jung was 9 years old. Jung's father was a minister in the Swiss Reformed Church. He was very legalistic. And, if I might say, kind of soft and maybe fear-based. Jung's mother was very traditional in the way she raised him, and frankly, he didn't have a lot of respect for her either. He felt that she just went along with the household duties and never had her own thoughts. And the person that he actually looked up to, believe it or not, was his grandfather. Because his grandfather was so different than his dad. He was a free thinker. He was a medical doctor, and he's married 3 times. Known as someone who had passion for what he was doing, had an open mind, wanted to see the role of medicine in the world. So this was somebody that Jung thought, this guy gets it. He's excited to be alive, and he's trying to bring things together. But his father wasn't like that. Now here's a simple little story that kind of sums it up. When Jung was a little boy, he would hear his father preach. And one of the things that he was very interested in was the Trinity. Even though he's a little kid, he thinks this kind of makes sense, that there's 3 different ways to experience God. And he thought, well, I'll ask my father. So he asked his dad, and of course his dad gets that deer in the headlights look and says something to the effect of, son, certain things you don't question. You just have to take them on faith. And Jung realized he doesn't understand either how important the Trinity is and what it means. He's accepting it rationally as an idea, but it doesn't move him.
Right.
He doesn't have a sense of how that's integrated into the world. So in some ways then, because we are influenced a lot by our parents, he reacted against his father. And he was kind of looking for a father. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about his relationship with Freud. But he then thought that his father's limited view was not a healthy one, and he didn't like a legalistic approach, and he took that with him into his studies in psychology. And he almost had really like a hang-up about authority.
Right.
He was a real nudge, you know. He didn't want anybody telling him anything. Maybe, you know, too much.
Right.
But those were some of the initial experiences that got him going.
Right. Now, if I remember correctly, I think I read at one point that he had some sort of experience where he saw his mother walking without a head and the head was floating. It was a very paranormal experience. Was that, do you know, does that ring a bell to you?
It does. And again, he saw everything as symbolic.
Right.
So let's just say that that experience was a dream. For him, that would indicate how deadly it is for a woman to not be in touch with her head, or for us as men to not be in touch with our anima.
Right.
That the two have to come together. And he spent his whole life trying to make these things happen.
Yeah.
That the left brain, the right brain attach, that love and thought attach. So that taught him something too, I think, about how dreams work and how the psyche works.
Right.
Because one of the things he said about the unconscious, again, we'll talk about that in a bit, is that the language of the unconscious is symbol.
Right.
It doesn't talk rationally. It gives us little cartoons, little pictures, stories, and here he had this image that came into his mind at some point of, whether it was a vision or a dream, of his mother walking around without her head attached.
Right, right. And I'm just thinking of how there was a predisposition within him and then both within young Teilhard to this almost ineffable sense of reality. And maybe we could call it a mystical sense, but it's just a little bit beyond the norm or beyond the bounds of what we would call normal, right? Yes. So, and it may be paranormal or whatever, but I remember the story of Teilhard crying at, I think, 6 years of age when he's getting his hair cut and he sees a lock of his hair fall into the fire, and the sense of impermanence that piece of hair burning up displayed to him just really emotionally, stirred him in a way that made him upset. So it's like, that's not, normal in a lot of ways of a 6-year-old.
No.
But what that says about our ability to feel in those higher ways and stuff, and then maybe, we come back to that at some point in our life when we're more in tune. But really, yeah, from the start, these guys both had a sense of there being a deeper and broader dimension of reality, where I'm thinking in Teilhard's own experience of being raised, he was raised in a very religious household. His mother was very religious, devout Catholic, and his father was a amateur naturalist. So he would take Teilhard outside and they would experience, in my own words, they'd experience God through the earth, through nature.
Sure.
And then in the house, Teilhard's experiencing God, not just through the religious instruction and catechism of his mother, but also through the very environment of the household, the movement of their year in terms of moving in sync with the liturgical year, the household with having symbols, crucifixes, devotional such as rosaries, things like that. Teilhard had a devotion to the Sacred Heart. So, we can only presume that, so much of this came from the household. Yes. And I would say maybe even bolstered that kind of mystical sense that both he and Jung displayed as younger people, where the experience of being a parent of young children, which I am right now, there is a tendency to say, stop that, right? There's a tendency to say, don't raise your voice, just keep it down, right? There's this tendency to want to keep them like in line, so to speak, right? But I think we all know that's not healthy. So, I'm just thinking here how, that kind of dynamic was maybe present in the household or not, as to allow them to experience, this larger sense of, whatever it is that they were seeking. But When I go back to Teilhard and Jung, I'm also brought back to the idea that they were both collectors at young ages. I know Jung would have his little totems and stuff he would have up in his attic. Teilhard had his little bits of rock and metal that he would collect, searching for some sort of permanent element that would not break or become brittle or erode in any way. I really wonder what it would have been like to be like a fly on the wall in the Jung or Teilhard de Chardin households growing up. Pretty unique experience. So something that you had talked about a little bit regarding Jung was symbol. And I'm curious if you might have any perspective on symbol in terms of looking into Teilhard's childhood and how that had an influence on him. Especially to, having a background within Catholic theology too. You have a deep understanding of these symbols. So I'm curious what your insight is there.
He seemed to swim in a world of symbols, and he didn't fight it. He was smart. He was always smart, and he knew that these things were not to be taken literally, but they were all pointing to something that was still real. He got, in my opinion, one of the best case scenario educations there of a Christian household. Right. In his case, a Catholic Christian household, in which the symbols resonated with what was going on inside his own psyche. And he realized that these things are important. They don't take us away from God. Right. These things can help us connect with God. And Jung had the same experience. Remember, he grew up in the Swiss Reformed Church. And they were probably the most iconoclastic religion that you're going to find.
So very bare walls.
Very bare walls, bare everything.
Stained glass?
No, okay. Not even a corpus, of course. They had just a crucifix up there and a little altar and a podium. And it was all, let's get back to the essence of the gospel and let's tear away emotion and feeling and color and movement. And there was something inside him, Jung, that realized, no, these things are good if they're understood properly. But here is how he was able to overcome that dichotomy. He saw that all of these things, these symbols, have meaning if they're seen as metaphors, not literal. Right. And again, we'll probably get into this a little later. That was one of the problems that he had with Christianity as he experienced. Everything was literal. Right. And from the time he was a young man, he actually says, when I was a boy, I saw things that other boys didn't see. I heard things that other boys didn't hear. And he realized that there was something deeper here that needed to be found. So, surprisingly, he became an advocate of the Catholic set of symbols. Even though, needless to say, he was not a Catholic, he didn't even see himself as a traditional Christian. He called himself an old witch doctor. But he was always trying to make connections, and he did it. Whereas for Teilhard, it was all natural. Right. He didn't question anything because it didn't cause a neurosis in him. He was allowed to pick up stones and see figurines that reminded him of things that he was feeling inside. And in the end, I think the reason that his family life was so healthy was that it always began and ended in the heart. Whereas Jung, it did not.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, Teilhard did come from a family that was a little bit more well-to-do than others. They had some, land in that way where they had a bit more affluence to allow them maybe an easier lifestyle per se in that way. But if you really want to get into his story and his person, then we see that there is a ton of struggle from the time he is, entering the Jesuits and facing some backlash for his teaching. It's really because he's popular. He's receiving some sort of pushback and skepticism. It really wasn't even because of his radical ideas yet, right? But then he's conscripted into the war, and he serves as a stretcher bearer during, at the time, what was really something revolutionary to the whole psyche of humanity in terms of this form of warfare that was taking place. And he's put into a crucible during that time where his faith becomes, and I use this word, holistically, but it becomes radicalized, it becomes dynamic, and it becomes so real where it becomes a leading edge of thought, both within science, both within theology. Of course, the church wasn't ready to even think about accepting it or consider reading it at the time, but and now we see, as we break into these new fields of scientific study, the interplay of all these fields, and especially these really quite mystical dimensions of like quantum reality and stuff like that, where so much is dependent upon an observer, and it's very relational, right, in terms of our experience of reality. So I feel like there is a shift where there is a shift in science, that's to say, where it's a fulfilling of Teilhard's prophetic words that that science will be increasingly impregnated by mysticism. The more we get to the nature of reality and what it is, the more we are mystified by it and totally, just bewildered at what we are beholding. So, for Teilhard, his journey led him to religious life, and that was really his seeking a way out, in a way. His pursuit at the time as a young man of spiritual things he thought needed to take him out of the world. So that's why he joined the Jesuits, and it's interesting to see that his road really kind of went in a different direction once he chose that path. But I'm curious if you might be able to share a little bit about Jung's struggles with his relationship with Freud, because I know that was seminal to his thought, and I think it's really going to set the stage for kind of these next two conversations that we'll have here, because it, much like Teilhard and his faith being something that was his sense of faith and his sense of God in the world and God in his own life really being cracked open and expanded during the war. I think that this moment for Jung was almost equally seminal moment within his young life. How old was he when this happened?
He would have been just out of medical school.
Okay.
By the way...
So that's probably young life.
Yeah. So just for the record, Jung was not a psychologist, even though 90% of the people in the world probably think that. He was a psychiatrist. He was a medical doctor. A neurologist, specifically. And he was interested in the way the brain works. And his interest then led him to Freud, who at that point was almost a demigod in terms of this new cutting-edge way of understanding humanity that dealt with the unconscious. That was the big thing. So Jung went and studied with Freud, and at first it looked like he had found the father that he was looking for. And it was as if Freud had found the son that he was looking for. There was a love there. There was a transference that was there. And Freud saw this brilliant young man, Carl Jung, as the eventual successor to carry on what he called the great work. He was never lacking in confidence. Freud, he called his work the great work.
His opus. The opus.
So here it is. He's a little bit older. He's written about dreams and the unconscious. And, real quick, I guess everybody is familiar with this image of the unconscious and Freud. It's the famous iceberg image, right? So the iceberg, what you see is just the tip of it. And that's the ego, the way people normally live their lives. And he says, oh, no, no, no. You have to go beneath the surface and you'll see that 90% of who we are is beneath the surface. This is the personal unconscious. Everybody said, okay, that makes sense. And then what's in there? Well, all the experiences that we've had in life, they're all dropped down there. Some of them are unhealthy. And psychoanalysis is like going fishing. You drop a line into the unconscious, you pull up different things, you look at them, and therefore they lose their power over you. You can now deal with these things as a healthy adult. So Jung is on board with all this. This makes sense. I mean, this was cutting edge.
Now, at the time, was this considered depth psychology, or did that name come later?
That came later in the way that we understand it.
Right.
But the very fact that he was dealing with the unconscious, to some people, that still meant depth.
Sure.
But it has to do with how deep you want to go to call it depth.
Gotcha.
So Jung is now, not questioning anything, and he's the golden boy. And one thing that was very different about Jung and Freud and a lot of doctors is he was also kind of an amateur anthropologist. He studied people. He traveled all over the globe. People didn't do that. He went to, for example, the Native Americans in North America. And before that, even more famously, he went to Africa. And he studied the different rituals that these people had. So, bear with me on this. What he discovered is that these people on different continents, broken up by vast bodies of water, all had very similar rituals in their religions and in their stories that they told to one another. And they helped people make sense out of who they were. Now, there's only two explanations for this. How could this be? He says, well, one explanation, the more literal one, would be, okay, different ships traveled to different continents. And no, that doesn't make a lot of sense.
And that takes a lot of time.
Well, that's a lot of ships and a lot of time. And you look at, people like the Aborigines in Australia, that doesn't make sense. The only other explanation is that, in a sense, we are born with this dimension of the unconscious that nobody has really been talking about, that has all these deep rituals and symbols in them, and he called that the collective unconscious. Okay, now he didn't invent it. God invented it, if you will. But he pointed it out. And okay, this started getting Freud nervous, because he said, no, you're talking about all these symbols. I'm trying to talk about people's experiences. And if you get too much into all this symbolism and dream work, you're going to bring my great work back 100 years. And we're going to lapse into superstition again. So here we go. Freud kind of presented this to Jung as, you're going to have to choose. If you want to be my successor here, enough with all this business about universal symbols, archetypes, he called them. Arche from the Greek, which means old, and typos, type, patterns, old patterns that we're born with. And Freud says, oh, no. And Jung says, oh, yeah. Not because I say so, but this, as a scientist, is something that I have experienced.
Evidence.
Yeah. So let me quickly try to tie this up here. Bottom line is Jung put his foot down, Freud put his foot down, and there was a break between the two. And it was an acrimonious break. And essentially, they didn't talk to one another anymore. And at least from Freud's point of view, Jung was now enemy number one. But there they went in their own way. Two great people. In terms of the contributions that each has made, they stand on their own. You know, the famous iceberg image and all the rest of it, the unconscious. But Jung also made a tremendous contribution about these universal symbols.
Yes.
Okay? Final point, that these symbols, if they are arranged properly, can help people make sense out of life. And that's the job of a good religion. And, of course, to Freud, this is even more heretical. Now we're talking about religion. As far as Freud was concerned, religion was part of the problem.
Right.
He hated religion. He had had a terrible experience with religion growing up.
Right. Well, maybe that's a big part of it.
Of course it is.
Can't glance over that.
Well, true. Yeah.
Because I'm wondering how, as you're going into the commonalities and then the divergence of Freud and Jung, how Freud failed to recognize these patterns taking place, especially being highlighted by not just the Christian or the Catholic Christian religious tradition, but by, like you said, modern religions around the world, ancient cultures around the world. It's been around forever. Where was, I don't need you to answer this, but it's very astounding to me that he glanced over that or didn't incorporate it at least.
Okay. I got to jump in on that one
Sure.
because that does make sense. What he grew up with was not so much a religious family as much as it was a psychologically repressive family. And the way God was presented was not the God of love, the God that rescues people, brings them out of captivity from Egypt, from his own Jewish tradition. No, God is that old man up in the sky wagging a finger.
Right.
Now, of course, you and I don't believe that. None of our listeners do. Jung didn't believe it. But Freud could never get beyond that. And, just an interesting little point here. It wasn't like he just felt sort of strongly about this. He wrote 3 books about the fact that religion was the enemy.
Okay.
Now, Jung didn't have a great experience with religion, but
Right.
he didn't see it as the enemy. He could see it actually could be helpful, but religion would have to go through a metamorphosis and change the way it looked at things so that it sees things more as metaphor
Right.
rather than literal.
Yeah, it's very interesting because we can all be pushed to that point where we become religious, right? As they say, there's no atheists in a foxhole, right? So, it's just something very interesting to reflect on when we think of how their theories went forward, how they pushed into the future, and especially now as we go back to incorporating Teilhard in our conversation of Teilhard and Jung and how his experience not just as a Jesuit but as a Jesuit that was also as a soldier serving in World War I, like I said earlier, expanded him up to that sense of God that was very much a catalyst to push him through the challenges that he faced in attempting to share that vision with the world. Much like Jung and his divergence from Freud, it was within his search for authenticity, both of his own self and then of his vision to be shared with the world in an authentic way. A mentally healthy individual doesn't want to share something, with everyone unless, they really feel like it's worthwhile, right?
Yeah.
We're not just preaching on street corners handing out pamphlets. We want to make sure we've got our stuff together before we present it in a way to people. So, this is obviously very worthwhile to both of them. But in terms of Teilhard, being able to deal with the challenges of the institution, and this is going to really transition us into our second conversation.
Sure.
But to, as we close this one out, to think about how, and as we go forward, Teilhard was able to maintain his sense of self, his sense of sharing this vision with a larger world, not just a larger church, but a larger world too, while knowing at the same time that he couldn't. So it was a juxtaposition, and I think it, in a way, gave him a kind of freedom.
Well, that was a real blessing to the world. And let me mention this about Teilhard and his Jesuit upbringing here. The group of priests that he joined forces with as a person. Thank goodness he was led in that direction.
Yeah.
If he, for example, had said, okay, I love God, I love rocks, I think there's something to evolution, and I'm going to become a diocesan priest.
Yeah.
He would have been drummed out of the seminary.
Right.
But he was led to this one group, and in particular, the French Jesuits were known as being real intellectuals, much more than like the American Jesuits were.
Okay.
Later in life, Teilhard was kind of shocked at almost the simplistic ideas that he found among the Jesuits in the United States.
Okay.
But he grew up with these folks who had open minds, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but didn't he run into somebody who told him in his training that if you have to choose between science and religion or belief, you have to start with science? Does that make sense, or did I make that one up?
It may be true. I don't know that you made it up, but I don't know that one.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't recall it in the moment. But
Okay.
I mean, to a large degree, it makes sense, because even if you go into the phenomenon of man, which I was planning on mentioning later, he says this is a scientific treatise, and he looks at things from that perspective too. So, I mean, it was very, very providential that he was able to be a French Jesuit in that way, where that freedom of thought was encouraged, and he was able to take that forward.
Yeah, and this much we know, and that is that he was allowed to pursue this. Imagine, again, if you're a diocesan priest and you want to study paleontology.
Right.
You're out the door.
Yeah.
That's not what you're here for, right? You're here to run this local church.
Right.
And he somehow got with this group of people that I think for the most part kind of gave him their blessing. I know it was controversial.
Yeah.
And when push came to shove, sometime the Vatican buckled under. The Jesuits buckled under to the Vatican, I should say, and sent Teilhard off packing on a long ship ride to China.
Yeah, the slow boat to China.
Yeah, the slow boat to China. That's what I was trying to think of. Thank you. But he was with these folks who pretty much supported him. And, later I want to talk to you about that, whether he made the right move staying with the Jesuits, because at a time they also began to squeeze him.
Right.
And his thinking was considered a little suspect, and he wasn't allowed to express himself fully. But all right, we'll talk about that a little later.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Well, I think that is a lot of rich content for our first conversation.
Sure.
We've set the stage in terms of the foundations of these two men, their upbringing, the influence and the lack thereof of religion in the household, and how that became very formational for their ideas. So we look forward to you joining us for the second part of 3 conversations on Teilhard and Jung. We'll see you next time.
Good. Thank you, sir.